Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Behind the Meter Solar Plus Storage Market Data and Trends. We have with us three excellent guest speakers from Berkeley Lab who will be presenting their latest research on this topic. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. And before we get started and pass this over to our excellent speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled on the webinar console. You can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we'd like to get to as many questions as we can. So to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note for you, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email later this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest with a copy of the webinar slides as well as a link to the webinar recording. And we'll also post all of those materials on Clean Energy Group's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because it's also where we list information about all of our upcoming webinars in addition to posting those webinar archive materials. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Seth Mullendore. Seth is Vice President and Project Director for Clean Energy Group, which, as I mentioned, is the group hosting this webinar. And Seth will get us started. Over to you, Seth.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thanks to everyone for joining us today to learn more about this great report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So for those of you that are not familiar with Clean Energy Group, we are a national nonprofit organization. We've been around for 20 plus years, working across the country to help enable an equitable and inclusive transition to our clean energy future. We are supported by a number of private foundations that you can see here. We also have a sister organization called the Clean Energy States Alliance that is a member organization representing largely a lot of energy agencies for some of the most progressive clean energy state agencies across the country. So this project is being brought to you, or this presentation is being brought to you by our Resilient Power Project. Resilient Power Project was established about 8 years ago in the wake of Superstorm Sandy and the outages that occurred in the Northeast following that storm. And it is designed to enable greater and more equitable access to resilient power technologies, which for our work primarily means access to solar PV and battery storage for energy resilience and also for economic and health benefits that come along with deploying the technologies. So to do this, we do a number of different things. We work to enable greater policies that enable greater access, particularly for low-income communities and communities of color. We do a lot of information sharing, a number of reports that you can see below that are available on our website as well, which you can find either at cleanegroup.org or resilient-power.org. We also work to help facilitate projects, and we work with primarily affordable housing and critical community facilities, which can range anything from a local emergency shelter or a church that provides community services up to first responders and even hospitals in some cases. And through our work, we provide technical assistance support, both in-house and through a technical assistance grant fund that we've established through the funding from our foundation partners. And through that work, we've worked with over 250 projects across the country. Every dot on this map represents a project that we've worked on, both in the housing sector and community services. And to date, over 30 of those projects have been built in various places across the country. So with that, I am going to introduce our speakers for today. As Sam mentioned, we have three great experts from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. First, we're going to have Galen Barbose, who is a research scientist in the electricity markets and policy development department at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Galen has worked at the lab for 20 years, conducting research on issues in the electricity industry surrounding renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric system planning. Galen is one of the principal investigators leading the group's solar energy related research activities with a focus on PV system pricing dynamics, adoption trends, and utility rates and regulatory policy. Then we'll hear from Salma Elmallah, and she is a graduate student research assistant in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab, and a PhD candidate in the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. Her work at Berkeley Lab focuses primarily on applying quantitative and qualitative methods to understand the social and economic impacts of large-scale renewable energy development, with additional work focusing on solar and storage adoption. She has a master's in energy and resources from UC Berkeley and a BS in electrical engineering from the University of Alberta. Then we will hear from Will Gorman. He's a graduate student researcher, also in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. And he focuses on the integration of variable generation into the electric power system, the economics of distributed energy resources, and the application of energy storage within electricity systems. Previously, Will worked with the utilities practice at Brattle Group, and has held positions with Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy, as well as UT Austin's Weber Energy Group. Will has a master's in energy and resources from the University of California, Berkeley, and holds a BS in chemical engineering and a BA in Plan 2 honors from the University of Texas at Austin. With that, I'd like to hand things over to Galen to start our presentation today.
Great, thanks Seth and Sam. Really appreciate the opportunity, and we're excited to be able to share the work with all of you listening in here today. So the report that we're going to be discussing is something that we published, I guess, maybe about a month or so ago. And I would just note that the report is itself a PowerPoint document that is almost identical to the presentation here today. We moved, I think, some of the material into an appendix, but otherwise it's more or less the same as the actual report. So, but if you do want to see the actual report as published, we'll provide a URL at the end of the presentation where you can download that. So we're going to do a little bit of a tag team here. I'm going to start off and then hand things over to Salma and Will, and then I think I'll kind of close things out briefly before we go to the Q&A. So in a nutshell, this report is largely focused on describing the market for behind the meter solar plus storage, including both residential and non-residential systems. That descriptive analysis covers kind of four broad areas. We look at deployment trends, we look at characteristics of these paired systems, we look at the installer market and the companies and firms that are installing these systems, and then we look at the installed prices for paired systems. And so those kind of are the four kind of core descriptive elements of this report, which we'll be talking about. In addition to those pieces, we also have these two separate analyses that are focused on different aspects of drivers for adoption of paired solar plus storage. And so the first of those focuses on kind of the financial value to the host customer, and really trying to understand what is the incremental value of adding storage to PV, looking at the bill savings and kind of incentives that are available. The other of those two kind of additional analyses focuses instead on the reliability or resilience value, and looking at kind of how well these systems potentially perform in allowing customers to back up their homes during an extended interruption. So that's kind of the report in a nutshell. before getting into the findings, I wanted to just say a little bit about the underlying data that informs most of the analysis we'll be presenting here. So the data is based largely on information that we collect through our annual Tracking the Sun report, which some of you may be familiar with. That report is focused really primarily on distributed solar, but through collecting that data, we obviously are obtaining increasing amounts of information about paired solar plus storage systems. The data, it consists of project level information for individual residential and non-residential systems that we collect from utilities and state agencies and a variety of other organizations around the country. Altogether, through that data set, we have about 50,000 individual residential solar plus storage systems and about 1,000 non-residential systems. And we estimate that represents roughly 90% of all paired residential and non-residential PV plus storage systems installed in the US through the end of last year. The figures here just kind of break that sample down over time and geographically, and the main thing I want to just stress there is that the sample, as with the larger market, is heavily dominated by California and Hawaii. And so although this is intended to be a national study, just by virtue of where the market really has evolved most, the trends that we'll be showing are very much indicative of what's happening in California and Hawaii, just by virtue of the relative share of the sample. So with that, let me kind of get into some of the key trends here. So I'm going to start out looking at some trends related to deployment levels. And the first figure here, this kind of Mickey Mouse Cyclops diagram, just is intended to give us a little bit of a sense of scale. And so what this figure shows is it represents all battery storage capacity installed in the US through the end of last year, and it breaks that capacity out by market segment, and then within each market segment, we show the portion that is paired with solar. And so, at bottom line, about 550 megawatts of behind the meter storage has been paired with solar. So that's kind of the universe that we're primarily concerned with for this study. That's 550 megawatts out of a total of roughly 3,200 megawatts of battery storage capacity, including utility scale. If you look at the residential portion of this figure, you'll see that the vast majority of all residential storage is paired with solar. On the non-residential side, the opposite is true. Most non-residential storage is actually installed on a standalone basis. About 40% is paired with solar. And then with utility scale, that percentage is even smaller, where about 19% of all utility scale storage has been paired with solar. These numbers are obviously changing rapidly as kind of the solar and storage markets evolve in the US, but this is kind of the picture as it existed as of the end of 2020. When folks think about deployment of solar plus storage, they often talk in terms of attachment rate. So that's the percentage of PV systems each year that are paired with storage. And the figures here show attachment rates for residential systems on the top and non-residential systems on the bottom. The thing that probably jumps out at you first is that Hawaii really is in kind of a category of its own in terms of the attachment rate. So, last year, for example, about 80% of all residential PV systems and 40% of non-residential systems installed in Hawaii were paired with storage. California, which represents in absolute magnitude the vast majority of all paired systems out there, about 8% of residential systems and 2% of non-residential PV systems were paired with storage. Outside of California and Hawaii, attachment rates are generally lower, though there are pockets of activity where we've seen higher attachment rates. And if you just look at the trends over time, in general, you can see that within the residential segment, attachment rates are kind of trending up. In the non-residential segment, it's a little bit more mixed, and at least at the kind of aggregate US level, they've been pretty flat over the past few years. So just to kind of look a little bit into why the attachment rates in Hawaii are so phenomenal, really in large part it has to do with the state's transition away from net metering. And the figure here attempts to show that. What we've done is the yellow line is just residential attachment rate, which we saw on the previous slide, and we've overlaid that on top of data showing how PV installations in each year are distributed across the different kinds of kind of compensation schemes. And so that you can see, the lightest shade is net metering, and then the darker shades are kind of the successor tariffs that the state has been moving towards. And those successor tariffs, importantly, provide a very strong incentive for customers to minimize the amount of solar generation that they're exporting to the grid, which for all intents and purposes means installing storage so that they can absorb that surplus generation and then use that kind of behind the meter at a later time during the day. And so you can see, clearly over time, as the market has moved away from net metering, you've seen this corresponding ramp up in storage attachment rates. The next slide here dives into California, and the story in California in terms of what's sort of driving adoption of paired systems. There are a couple key factors. One is the existence of a rebate program, the self-generation incentive program, which has been around for a long time and provides incentives for customers to install behind the meter storage. And then the other key driver has been just the emergence of resilience-related concerns in the wake of wildfires and public safety power shutoff events, PSPS events that the utilities have instituted to try to avoid potential power line induced wildfires. And those PSPS events, I mean, they've occurred statewide, but they've been most acute within PG&E's service territory. And so what we've done here is we've just broken out the data by utility, at least among the three kind of major investor-owned utilities in the state. The figure on the top shows attachment rates. The one on the bottom just shows the absolute number of interconnections per month for paired residential systems. And you can see here most clearly in the bottom figure where we have that line showing when the major PSPS events began in the state, that in PG&E's service territory in particular, there's been this very sharp increase in the adoption of paired systems after that point. Now, to be fair, before the PSPS events occurred, those adoptions were already increasing, and so it is not immediately obvious whether what we're seeing is just a continuation of that trend or some direct response to the PSPS events. But I think it is worth just noting that for the other two utilities, after those PSPS events occurred, adoption rates remained pretty much flat, whereas they were increasing quite rapidly for PG&E. And part of what may be going on there is sort of a pandemic effect that was suppressing adoption within the other utility service territories, but within PG&E's territory where there was this strong countervailing factor of the PSPS events that kind of really dominated the trends and was enough to kind of outweigh the muting that the pandemic otherwise would have caused. This next slide here drills in even further, looking at attachment rates at the zip code level for a few different states. So with California, you can see that these zip code level attachment rates, they vary widely across the state from anywhere from 0 to 70% last year. You can see in the kind of North Bay, north of San Francisco Bay part of the state, that attachment rates in that area are generally relatively high. And for those that are from California or are familiar with kind of the state's recent history with wildfires, that part of the state has been quite severely impacted by wildfires and by PSPS events. And so some of what we're seeing there may be kind of a direct response to that. To be sure though, demographics also likely play a role. If you look at the 10 zip codes in California with the highest attachment rates, 9 of those zip codes are exceptionally affluent communities. And one of the figures that I've relegated to the appendix for the purpose of this presentation, but it shows income levels for adopters of paired systems compared to just standalone PV adopters. And you can see that in fact, those households that are adopting paired systems do tend to be wealthier than typical PV adopters who themselves are wealthier than just your average household. So that's kind of the story in California. Hawaii, it's uniformly relatively high attachment rates. Arizona, which we haven't yet talked about, I wanted to include here just because it does illustrate how there can be kind of pockets of activity within a state that otherwise might not really stand out as being a hotbed of solar plus storage adoption. And so within Arizona, you can see, so we've got the lines that sort of outline different utility service territories. And you can see SRP, Salt River Projects service territory in the middle of the state, that the attachment rates there are relatively high. And the reason for that is that SRP a while ago has sort of transitioned its rate structures for solar PV customers towards a set of rate designs that kind of heavily incentivize PV customers to install storage. And that includes a tariff with demand charges, for example. So within SRP's service territory, we see typically kind of 10, 20% attachment rates, depending upon the particular area of the state. The highest attachment rates in Arizona actually aren't in SRP's territory, but instead are in that upper northwestern quadrant of the state. And when we first saw this data, it wasn't really obvious what was going on there, but with a little Google searching, we were able to discover that really what that has to do with is a private partnership between Sonnen, a battery manufacturer, and a large housing developer who decided to install solar plus storage systems as a standard feature on homes throughout a bunch of large housing developments in the region. And so that is really almost entirely what is driving those high attachment rates in that part of the state. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So now I want to talk a little bit about the technical characteristics of these systems. The first slide here focuses on residential systems, and we've got a bunch of different figures, a lot of information, but the key kind of takeaways are all pretty straightforward. So let me just kind of walk through these, starting with the figure in the upper left, which shows the breakdown of storage manufacturers just among paired residential systems. And there you can see that it's really Tesla and LG Chem that represent the vast majority of all the battery storage systems that are being installed as in paired applications. And in particular, it's really Tesla Powerwalls and the LG Chem Resu 10H unit. Those are both 5 kilowatt power rated batteries. The energy capacity differs a little bit between the two, where Tesla has almost a 3-hour duration, whereas the LG is more like a 2-hour duration battery. Most paired residential systems consist of just a single battery unit, one of these 5 kilowatt units. But as the figure on the upper right shows, multi-battery systems have become more common over time. Last year, about 40% of all residential systems had either one, had more than one battery. 40% of all paired residential systems, I should say, had more than one battery. And I think really what's driving that is just this increasing interest in the use of these systems for kind of backup power and resilience purposes, where customers are wanting to be able to maintain larger amounts of load or maintain load for larger periods of time. And then so that's driving them to install larger battery systems. In terms of the PV portion of these paired systems, we find that within paired applications, the PV systems tend to be somewhat larger than what we see in standalone solar applications. That's what the figure on the lower left shows. And again, I think that may be partly due to kind of the same sort of resilience type of consideration where customers are wanting to be able to maintain power for longer periods of time or provide larger levels of backup coverage. And then last, the figure on the lower right, that just shows the relative size of the storage units compared to the PV units. And we do that in terms of in both kilowatt and kilowatt hour terms, where the kilowatt hour ratio is the ratio of the storage energy capacity to the average daily PV energy production. And so across the systems that were installed last year, that ratio typically ranges somewhere from 30% to 80%. So in other words, between 30 to 80% of your typical PV daily generation can get stored in the battery for use at a later time. And that ratio is important when thinking about the potential use of these systems, both in backup power applications and also for just managing surplus solar generation if customers are under a tariff where that's being encouraged. The next slide here basically shows an analogous set of figures for non-residential systems. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but if folks are interested, we can certainly come back to that as well. The next set of slides here focus on the installer market, kind of the features of the firms that are installing paired systems. This slide here focuses on residential systems, and again, there's a lot of information, but I think the basic takeaways are pretty simple. The figure on the upper left shows that about 50% of all residential installers have installed at least one PV plus storage system. And I was sort of surprised by that. As you may recall, only 6% of all PV systems included storage, but half of all PV installers have installed at least one paired system. And so that, I think, speaks to just, fairly broad level of market acceptance of this technology within the installer community. That being said, the market is quite concentrated. That's what the figure on the upper right shows, where we look at the HHI index. So this is a measure of market concentration, comparing that index for paired systems versus standalone systems. Larger number means more concentrated, and so you can see, pretty much uniformly across all the states and for the U.S. as a whole, the market for paired systems is much more concentrated. The figure on the lower left maybe shows that a little bit more obviously or intuitively, where we just show the kind of the market share among different installation firms, where you can see that about 60% of all paired residential systems last year were installed by just 10 firms. 2 of those, Tesla and Sunrun, each had about a 20% market share, and then the remainder of the top 10 were mostly local Hawaiian and California firms. And then the last slide on the lower right shows installer level attachment rates. So what fraction of each installer's PV systems were paired with storage, focusing just on California and in particular looking at the top 10 installers in terms of the numbers of PV systems that they installed last year. And this figure shows a pretty stark dichotomy among these large installers, where you can see, some of them, Tesla, Sunrun, and Semper Solaris, they, between 25 and 30% of their PV systems included storage last year. But among the other large PV installers in the state, those attachment rates are much, much lower. And that, I think, just kind of speaks to the state of the market and maybe a kind of a lack of consensus in terms of the business case at this point for PV installers to really go all in on kind of paired systems as kind of the default mode. The next slide here, again, is looking at non-residential systems, kind of an analogous set of figures. I will also skip over this one, but folks should feel free to ask about this if you like, and we can come back to it in the Q&A. So my last section, which I'm gonna kind of skip over most of the slides for, but I do want to provide a little bit of information here on installed pricing. And really what we're concerned with here mostly isn't just trying to understand the premium associated with adding storage to PV. So how much more does it cost above a standalone PV system to have to include storage? And we have a number of different data sources that we use for this. Our Tracking the Sun data set. There's data from the California Self-Generation Incentive Program. And then we also receive some data from Energy Sage, which operates an online platform where customers can request quotes from installers for both standalone PV systems and paired systems. And we've got a bunch of different slides here. I'm not going to walk through each one. I will just sort of pause on this one very briefly. This one presents data from the Tracking the Sun data, where we have information on the total reported price for both paired systems and for standalone systems. And so we can compare those total system level prices to kind of infer that premium amount. And when we do that, we see that for residential systems, it's a difference of about $1.20 per watt of PV, or about a 33% increase over the price of a standalone system for paired systems. So that's what the figure on the top shows. The figure on the bottom, I wanted to just make sure I cover this. This shows trends over time in the reported prices for paired systems. And interestingly, what we see here is that prices have been going up for paired systems. So even though the price of standalone residential PV has been going down, and we often sort of think about the cost of storage as going down, at least in terms of the price that the final kind of end use customer is paying for these paired systems, those prices have actually been trending up over time, and most likely that's just a reflection of kind of supply chain constraints within the battery storage market. So the next set of slides kind of basically provide a bunch of corroborating evidence and information from these other data sources. I'm going to just fast forward to the last slide in this series, where we kind of bring it all together. At the top, we have some other kind of anecdotal data points which we wanted to include. And then at the bottom, we've just tried to sort of synthesize all the disparate information sources that I just skipped over to kind of give you some bottom line numbers. And those bottom line numbers are that, to add storage to PV typically is going to cost, at least now, around $1,000 per kilowatt hour of storage capacity, though there's certainly a range across the different data sources and an even wider range across individual projects. And in terms of the kind of installed price premium above a kind of standalone system, for residential systems, that is about $1.20 per watt PV. And that's consistent with the data point that I shared earlier from Tracking the Sun. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Salma, who is going to talk about kind of the financial value to the site host of adding storage to PV. So Salma, take it away.
Thanks, Galen. Yeah, so as Galen said, this section basically asks if a host customer, residential or non-residential, already has a solar system installed, then what is the financial value of adding storage, considering rates and incentives? So we can move to the next slide. So our basic approach here was first to select key markets for residential and non-residential customers. So for residential customers, we focused on Hawaii, California, including both PG&E and SCE, and Arizona, so the SRP utility service territory. And for non-residential customers, we looked only at California, comparing both PG&E and SCE. And our analysis was situated in 2020. And so we considered rates and incentives in that year. So we looked at utility bill savings using NREL's Reopt Lite tool to estimate a customer's yearly bill. And we also looked at state and utility rebates and direct incentives, the federal ITC, and accelerated cost recovery. And so just to add some context to our analysis, we're just focusing on a subset of states. And because it's a retrospective analysis, there are a lot of other emerging value streams and regulatory or rate changes that we're not considering, but could change the economics for a host customer. Next slide. So we start here with residential cases. So we looked at HECO, PG&E, SCE, and SRP. And so the figure on the left shows what we estimate to be the savings, the financial value per kilowatt hour of adding storage to PV. So this kind of dark blue bar at the bottom indicates the savings from the ITC, which is the same nationwide. And then the yellow is the rebate value. So in California, that's a state level rebate. And in Arizona, it's a utility rebate. And then that green bar is the bill savings. And to calculate the bill savings, we had to make some assumptions about the customer's PV to load ratio. So these bars show an assumed 80% PV generation to load ratio, but we also tested higher and lower values. And we essentially looked at all of the rates in a given utility area that a customer would qualify for, and assumed that they would choose the least cost tariff when they have just solar installed and also when they have solar and storage installed. And so these lines indicate just the range of values depending on the various PV to load ratios and tariffs. So if you look at the right side of the slide, we've put some takeaways. So the source of the bill savings varies based on where a customer is located. In Hawaii, export credit rates and retail rates play a role. In California, time of use arbitrage, and in Arizona, demand charge savings are important. And if you account for kind of the range of PV to load ratios and diversity in utility tariffs, the savings range from $500 to $1,000 per kilowatt hour. But if you consider that adding storage to PV costs $700 to $1,200 per kilowatt hour, in many cases, the savings don't really or just barely exceed that cost. But they do make the most sense in California for customers with relatively small PV systems or large loads. And so what we found in the residential case is that co-adoption probably isn't driven or isn't significantly driven by financial considerations. And there are probably other considerations at play here for residential customers. Next slide. So when we move on to non-residential cases, our figure on the left is really similar to the last one, but here we've considered a range of non-residential customers using the Department of Energy's model load shapes. So we considered primary schools, supermarkets, secondary schools, large offices, and hospitals. And we chose the non-residential buildings that would be large enough to host a 200 kilowatt PV system, which is a value that we chose based on the data that we have for the sizing of PV systems for non-residential customers. So looking at these two California utilities, customers would have access to the same ITC, the same financial benefit from accelerated depreciation, and the same kind of level of rebates per kilowatt hour. And so the variation here comes from the bill savings. And here we use a similar methodology as we did with the residential case. So we used Reopt Lite, and we considered all of the rates that a customer would be eligible for as a non-residential customer given their load size at each utility. And so here we found that the savings for non-residential customers are much higher than residential customers. It came out to values of $1,200 to $2,000 per kilowatt hour. And so you can attribute that to the tax incentive and also differences in rate structures, where commercial and industrial customers have access to rates that have relatively high demand charges. But even though we found that there seems to be a clear financial value for non-residential customers, pairing storage with a solar system is still less common for non-residential PV. And so a couple of reasons why that might be is that the number of non-residential PV adopters that use these high demand charge rates might be limited. And also non-residential customers just might have more stringent kind of organizational financial criteria that they have to meet to adopt technology than residential PV adopters do. So our overall takeaway from this host customer financial value analysis is that for residential customers, the financial value of adding storage to solar isn't obvious, which might indicate other motivations. And for non-residential customers, the financial value is clear, but co-adoption is relatively low, which might indicate kind of other dynamics at play in that decision-making process. And that concludes this section. We can move on to the next.
Great. So thanks, Salma. I think that tees up this section actually quite well, those conclusions, and is in part the motivation for this section. So I'll be wrapping up this last little analytical piece of work we did on this project before turning it back to Galen, and that was on what level of backup power protection can these residential solar and storage systems offer as they're currently deployed, as the, kind of another motivator for the adoption in the residential sector, at least. You can go to the next slide, Galen. So I'll talk somewhat quickly about our basic approach, and I encourage questions as you have them, and also on the online report, there is an appendix where you can see some more of these details, but just given time constraints today, we won't go too much into these, but at a high level, what we do is we take simulated hourly solar and load data, and with that data, we assume a typical residential system size, and then estimate the percentage of a residential customer's consumption each day over the course of a year that could be served by that behind-the-meter PV plus storage system. And this gives just a rough sense for how much load could be maintained in the event of an outage, but of course we're looking at a more demanding situation because we're looking at over the entirety of a year. We do focus on 4 states because we couldn't be exhaustive here, so just some representative states, familiar states that you've seen kind of throughout this presentation. So we look at Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Massachusetts. This typical standard size we look at is the 7 kilowatt PV and then a 5 kilowatt, 10 kilowatt hour storage system. And that's just in line with the numbers that Galen had presented earlier in this presentation. We really just wanted to look at the most standard size to see what the capabilities were. But the second piece of analysis that I will talk about before concluding and turning it back to Galen is, let's kind of do a hypothetical. What is the system size that would be required to meet increasing percentages of an annual customer's load? So that's thinking about potentially going all the way up to full grid defection. What system size would be needed if you just want to provide your home's energy year-round. But we look at that as at an increasing scale to see how that system size changes. And so that will be the second set of results that I'll present. Go ahead to the next slide, Galen. All right, so this is that first set. So again, get back to that daily load that could be served by these systems. That's what we're looking at here. And I'm gonna talk about it by walking through the graphs. So if you look at the top graph, what you're seeing is over the course of the year, how these typical PV storage systems, what percentage of the daily load could be served by those systems, and it's broken out by state. So some interesting things that kind of pop out. There's a lot of volatility in this metric, and what's driving that is weather patterns for the most part. So you can see that pretty distinctly in Massachusetts as you get into the winter months, when there's more cloud cover, snow events, that seriously depresses your solar production, and then therefore it has an impact on the amount of daily load that you can serve. And so you can see that to a certain extent in the other regions as well for precipitation events. I'm going to step through coarser and coarser levels of this metric as we walk through these next graphs to see maybe some seasonal and annual differences between these regions. So if you go now to these bottom graphs, you look at the one on the left, now we're plotting that same metric but averaged over the month, and some seasonal trends start to appear. So you can see, in the summer, California, Massachusetts, you're producing more solar. It's easier to serve that daily load with that energy, and you see that in the trends here. Correspondingly, in Arizona, which is a relatively hot and dry climate, it is true that you're producing more solar in those months, but on the flip side, you have significantly increased cooling loads due to that heat, and that then therefore takes a significant hit on that metric in those months. So it's kind of interesting to see that how these different regions will have different capabilities depending on the weather profiles that you see. And the last metric that I'll just quickly wrap up before we're going into the second results is that in this bottom right figure, we show the annual average of that metric. So you can see how California is the highest. Hawaii is actually the lowest, but if you're a baseline kind of median type of customer, you can serve roughly 60 to 80% of these daily loads is what we found. But if we assume a higher demand customer, that metric gets depressed a little bit to about 50%. So that's the average daily load served over the entire year is what that metric is showing. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly because I know we have questions on the other end here. But this was that grid defection, how large would a system need to be to maintain higher levels of load served? That's the analysis that I'm presenting here. And then these figures on the x-axis is that metric, the annual load served. And then the top one, we're looking at PV system sizes. And the bottom, we're looking at storage system sizes. And then for a base median customers load level, and then a high consumption customer. And what you can see here is that we found that meeting 90% of the annual load would require systems that are bigger than that typical size. So we're looking at 8 to 14 kilowatts of PV and 15 to 22 kilowatt hours of storage, but they're not dramatically higher. And Galen did show that some customers are adopting 2 to 3 batteries. So this isn't necessarily out of the realm of possibility. But is absolutely higher. But what we found is once you go to 100%, even 99%, you see these large upticks in this system size need. And not only that could be financially constraining, obviously, but you also start to bump into space constraints, likely even in single family home characteristics. So definitely a limitation when thinking about this annual load served. But the last point I'll make before handing the baton back is there were some things that we didn't consider. And so we didn't look at energy efficiency or load flexibility here, which could enable smaller solar plus storage system sizes, depending how those get integrated. We didn't consider the difference between critical loads and maybe less critical loads. And you can imagine that if you create a priority circuit for these solar and storage systems, that might also reduce the burden to be able to meet this daily load. And so there definitely are some limitations. This was our kind of dip our toe in the water analysis, and we're actually instituting a multi-year project where we're going to try to explore some of these interactions in a little bit more depth and study how outage events actually could be mitigated by these systems. So definitely stay tuned to our work in this space because we are not done looking at these reliability outcomes in particular. And with that, I'll pass it back to Galen.
All right, thanks, Will. So just the last slide here covers some conclusions, which more or less reiterate some of the key points that we've already highlighted. So I think in the interest of just leaving as much time as possible now for Q&A, I'm just going to kind of actually bypass these conclusions, and we'll just leave us on this slide here where you can find our contact information. You can also find the URL, our publications link here if you want to download the actual report that we publish, which, as I mentioned, looks a lot like this presentation, but it has a few additional slides that we've sort of put in the appendix here. So with that, Seth, I think I'll turn it over to you for some questions.
Great. Thank you, Galen, and thank you, Salma and Will as well. So yeah, we do have several questions that have come in. To kick things off, there was a question really that was talking about California and the evolution of net energy metering policy there, but could be anywhere where the current NEM 3.0 proceeding in California looks like it will severely reduce the value of exported solar in California. So would you think that with that change in California or other places that the attachment rates for storage might start to look a lot more like Hawaii?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the changes that are being contemplated in California, some of them very much resemble exactly what Hawaii has done. And so, yeah, no, I think absolutely that could and probably would happen. I think, you know, as there's always sort of this tension between kind of the actual economics and individuals' perceptions of the economics. And I think, you know, what we showed in Hawaii is that even though there is this pretty, you know, sharp incentive through the rate design to minimize exports to the grid, it actually still isn't enough to make storage pencil out. But yet we see customers, you know, adopting storage in droves. So, you know, I think that just goes to show just how potent that signal is, even if, you know, the actual economics don't sort of ultimately pencil out.
Great. Thanks for that, Galen. A question, and I thought this was interesting, about the drivers of storage to add multiple battery systems. There was a question if that could at all be technology related. For instance, folks that are installing a level 2 EV charger, which I'm not actually sure, and I think the questioner wasn't sure either, whether a, say, 5 kilowatt battery system would be able to support the full level 2 charging, or whether you would need two battery systems to be able to support the power needed for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know sort of technically what, you know, whether you would need multiple batteries. I think I do vaguely remember looking at just some kind of materials on Tesla's website where they provide some illustrative cases of the kinds of loads that you could back up with either 1, 2, or 3 batteries. And I do seem to remember that, you know, if you want to be able to charge an EV, you definitely need more than one, at least based on kind of those examples that they provided. I think that's really interesting, and it makes me want to sort of investigate the data and see if we can try to understand kind of the co-adoption there between electric vehicles and battery storage in general, but as this questioner asked about kind of multi-battery systems. So that's a great question.
And I might
just
quickly jump in. I mean, my understanding is that level 2 is maybe at a 7 kilowatt power draw, so that is, you know, lower than the 5 kilowatts that we were seeing here. So I definitely could see that there's some technical constraint there. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, you know, EVs are also battery systems themselves, and I think, you know, there's definitely questions of, do you want to buy the Tesla Powerwall to back up your car, where your car actually would be a larger battery, you know, on a kilowatt hour basis than the Tesla Powerwalls that you're purchasing. So you know, the point that Galen mentioned is definitely interesting. And but it's unclear to me if the Powerwalls are going to be backing up the cars, or the cars are going to be backing up the homes. I think there's some interesting interactions for sure to follow in the future years.
Yeah, that is a great point, Will. You know, in looking at the Ford's F-150, I mean, specifically you can get it designed to back up your home. It just goes to the question, I guess, of where the balance is for people powering their homes versus having a vehicle available in an emergency situation without power. So, to be continued. So there was a question. A few people would like to go back to one of the slides that was skipped, Galen, talking about the commercials storage slide. And there was also related to that some questions just about additional costs that maybe for larger systems would become important, like operation and maintenance, software costs to manage the battery over time. I don't know if you investigated any of those costs on the commercial side.
No, we didn't. We were, I think, for this purpose, really primarily focused on just understanding kind of the upfront capital investment cost. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think looking at the kind of cost and value of these systems on a life cycle basis, those are important as well. So here is one of the 2 non-residential slides that I skipped over, focusing on kind of the system characteristics. And as with the residential slide, it sort of starts with some information on the upper left, showing the distribution of different battery storage manufacturers. And there you can see that although Tesla definitely dominates, but the manufacturer kind of market segmentation is a little bit more diversified than what we see on the residential side. So that's one, I think, useful distinction, though keeping in mind we are talking about relatively small numbers of systems here. The figure on the upper right just shows the battery system sizes that are being used in paired non-residential applications. And though the sizing varies quite a bit from project to project, as you can see by those percentile bands, at least in the median case, we're looking at 100 kW batteries with 200 kilowatt hours of storage. And most of these are, as those numbers imply, 2-hour storage batteries. And just, if you can recall the analysis that Salma presented, where she looked at kind of the bill savings value for non-residential storage systems, this is where the 100 kilowatt or 200 kilowatt hour battery assumption came from. It's kind of looking at the typical size that's being installed. The lower left figure compares PV system sizes between paired and standalone applications. And here we see a really stark difference, much more dramatic than on the residential side, where the PV systems that are being installed in paired applications are much larger than your typical non-residential standalone PV system. So, 200 kW PV system in a typical paired application versus something like a 40 kilowatt system as a kind of typical standalone PV system. And a lot of that, I think, is driven by the types of customers who are motivated to install paired systems. So, with storage, obviously one of the key kind of value propositions for a non-residential customer is demand charge savings. And non-residential rates with heavy demand charges tend to be focused on relatively large non-residential customers. So just kind of by virtue of that, kind of the kind of driving force for adoption here being demand charges, that kind of naturally drives adoption towards this kind of larger non-residential customer. So that I think is really why we're seeing that trend in the lower left. And then on the lower right, it just compares, again, the storage to PV system sizes. And here the ratios are generally lower. So in other words, relative to the PV system size, the storage systems are smaller in capacity on the non-residential side than what we see on the residential side, typically somewhere between 10% and 40% of the daily average PV production can be stored in the battery. So that's the one of the two non-residential slides that I skipped over. We've only got a minute or two left, so maybe I'll pass it back to you, Seth, to see if there's maybe one last question or any closing comments that you wanted to make.
Yeah, let's see if we can get to one last question, because I think this is a good one. It's talking about the increase in the availability of utility demand response programs or virtual power plant programs, which some of the big vendors are also starting to get involved with, like Sunrun and Tesla, and some of the utilities across the country have been doing more. We've seen a lot of that in the Northeast, and in California has been talking a lot about using behind the meter systems for reducing demand during peak demand periods. How do you see that playing into the economics of these systems, and do you expect to include the revenue contribution from demand response or virtual power plant opportunities in future assessments?
Yeah, no, I think if we were to do this again, and we don't have any immediate plans to do so, but yes, certainly we would want to capture any important value streams that have really emerged and are, ostensibly playing some role in the deployment trends that we see. This analysis was kind of by design more retrospective in nature, but I think, as Salma mentioned, there are a lot of really interesting new revenue streams that are on the horizon and that could materially impact things. And I think that will be really interesting and exciting to see.
Great. Well, thank you, Galen, Salma, and Will. This was a really great presentation. And for folks that have asked, this is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording and slides with everyone within the next day or two. You'll get an email from us on that. So with that, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and I'll pass it back over to Sam for a few webinars that are coming up that the Clean Energy Group will be presenting.
Thanks, Seth. So we do have a couple of exciting webinars coming up. The first is on August 25th. The topic is the LA 100 study, lessons for state 100% clean energy planning. And then the next day on August 26th, we will have a webinar on energy storage policy best practices from New England. And that's definitely applicable beyond New England. It's based on a new study that we just put out from Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance. So two very exciting webinars next week, and you can register for those on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So we hope to see you then. Thank you everyone for attending today, and we hope to see you next week. Bye everyone.